Here's a story that caught my attention from the Post Millennial, and reading now of the article. The Biden administration has issued new federal regulations that mandate museums to get consent from Native American groups before displaying or performing research on cultural items. The New York Times reports that the rule is part of the National Park Service new regulations for the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act and provide a step-by-step roadmap with specific timelines for museums and federal agencies to facilitate disposition or repatriation. These regulations have caused the Museum of Natural History, founded by President Teddy Roosevelt, to close two major exhibit halls that house Native American artifacts and objects on the Eastern Woodlands and the Great Plains. The new rules offer systematic processes through which museums and federal agencies must defer to the Native American traditional knowledge of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. This went into effect on January 12th, so it just went into effect. In taking the drastic action, Museum President Sean Decatur sent a letter to staff explaining why that research and information would no longer be available to museum visitors. Quote, "The halls we're closing are artifacts of an era when museums such as ours did not respect the values, perspectives, and indeed shared humanity of indigenous peoples. Actions that may feel sudden to some may seem long overdue to others. 10,000 feet of exhibition space will be closed to the public because of this plan to stop showing Native American art and artifact out of concern that sharing the history of Native Americans would be offensive to Native Americans." Decatur said that some objects may never come back on display, but he said that others may after they get clearance from the Native Americans or whatever. Let's just track this. Let's go through the timeline here, okay? It began with the mascots, right? We're told that we can't use Native American imagery or mascots or references or names or whatever for sports teams because that's offensive to Native Americans somehow. We need their permission, right? We need their permission to have mascots that have something to do with Native Americans. Now, we still have not applied that to anybody else. Nobody has asked for my permission as a person of Irish descent for Notre Dame to continue calling itself the Fighting Irish and to have the drunken leprechaun Irish guy mascot. Nobody's asked me about Lucky Charms. No one's asked me about that. As far as I know, nobody's consulted any person of Irish descent about that. So Native Americans they're special. You know, they're put in a special category, and we need to treat them with kid gloves, and something that is fine for everybody else is not okay for them because of how special they are. So we ended up getting rid of most of those mascots and team names. Okay. And notice every step along the way, as always, they say that, well, it's just this. This is all we're going to do. You know, we just want to get rid of the mascots. It's offensive. And then we'll stop. That's it. That's all we got to do. So, don't make a big deal out of it. They want to change Redskins because it's offensive and they want to call it something else. They want to change it to the lamest name ever conceived. It's fine, but don't make a big deal because it's just that. It's just a mascot. What do you care about the mascot so much? Well, then they quickly moved over to other depictions of Native Americans. We had to take the Native woman off of the Land O'Lakes box of butter. We had to get rid of Native imagery in all of these kind of commercial areas, even where it's not cartoonish or funny. It's not supposed to be a joke. Land O'Lakes butter, it was literally just a depiction of a Native American woman. She was just sitting there. There was nothing offensive about it. It wasn't cartoonish. It wasn't a caricature. But even there, just the depiction itself is offensive. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Okay. Where else have you heard of anything like this? Where it's now offensive to simply just depict in any context someone else. Really, we have turned Native Americans into these deity-like creatures. So we are adopting the same reverence for Native Americans that Muslims have for the Prophet Muhammad. So it's just like in Islam, there are no depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. We're doing the same thing with Native Americans. There are no depictions. You can't depict them. These are sacred beings. These are sacred beings, and to depict them at all is crass and exploitative. What does that apply to other people? Well, no. So Okay, so you can't have the Native American on the butter box, but you can have anybody, like if it was just a white woman, it'd be fine? Oh yeah, of course. But why is that fine? I thought you just said it's exploitation. So it's only exploitation for them because they're special, you see. And that was all bad enough. But that, of course, the left argued, that's it. That's all we're doing. You can't do mascots. We're not going to really explain why. It doesn't make sense. You can't have them in any kind of commercial depiction. Again, we can't explain why, but just go with us. We stopped there. That's it. That's the end of it. Okay. Well, now we've moved to museum exhibits. Okay. Now they're saying you can't even have Native American references and depictions and artifacts in museums. The one place where they always said, well, of course there. Of course there. Obviously. It's not like we're going to start taking them out of museums. Well, now they're taking them out of museums too. Like, these are places that exist to preserve history. And somehow to preserve the history of Native societies is offensive to them. Or at least we need to get their permission. Whose permission exactly? Whose permission are we getting? Tell me, what special communal board or individual decides whether, they talked about the Great Plains. So the Great Plains artifacts can't be displayed. And again, by the way, so we're not just talking about like you go to the Smithsonian and they have wax figures and that sort of thing, and these displays of Native. They're not just saying you can't have that because that'd be crazy enough. They're saying just artifacts. Like if there was an arrowhead, that 180-year-old arrowhead from the Comanche tribe that they found on the Great Plains, you can't even show that. Why? Because you didn't get permission. From who? From the guy who died 180 years ago, whose arrowhead it was? Whose permission are you asking? Well, you got to get permission from some native person. So you got to find some woman working in a cubicle, some like middle-aged woman working in a cubicle in Iowa somewhere with native ancestry. We had to get her permission. Who the hell cares about her permission? She doesn't own it. She has no relationship to it. Now, if you have a family heirloom in your house that has been passed down through the generations, yes, you own that. And I would be very much against the Smithsonian barging into your home and taking your family heirloom. I'd be very opposed to it. But that's not what these are. These are artifacts that have been found and they've been given to the museum. And now it's like we're saying that random people, because they can supposedly trace their heritage back to people related to that artifact, they get to decide if anyone gets to look at it, okay? And aside from the question of ownership, since when do we allow ethnic groups to have absolute say on how their own history is told? And I asked that question, and these days, I think the question itself will seem like absurd to some very stupid people, because they'll say, well, of course we should have let them decide. No. That's not how it works. History is not owned, okay? You don't own the history of your own ethnicity. You don't own that. It's a thing that happened. You don't get to take ownership of it. Anyone else can talk about it. They can write about it. They can give their own perspective on it. They can research it. It's not an object that you own, you lunatics. Whatever happened, happened. Okay? Nobody owns history. You don't get to decide what we say about it or remember about it or what artifacts we get to look at just because you had an ancestor 200 years ago tied to that history, supposedly. And the really absurd thing is, they usually say, this, as the saying usually goes, that the winner gets to write the history book, right? Well, we have flipped that completely on its head. Because the Indian tribes lost. They lost the Indian Wars. I mean, they lost one battle after another, just nothing but taking L's, frankly. Like, it was hundreds of years of losing. And they were conquered, and they lost. And now we've decided that the losers get to have total control over how their own history is told. This is the price we're supposed to pay for the unforgivable white sin of bringing civilization to the new world. because we were supposed to be pleading forgiveness for the fact that we don't all currently live in a world that's 3,000 years in the past, that people are still getting scalped, right? And your mother and your daughter could be kidnapped and enslaved by a raiding party at any time, because that's the world that the Indians all lived in, every single one of them, okay, lived in a violent, brutal, warfaring society. And our great sin is making sure that we don't live in that world anymore. Like the fact that we all live in a world that none of us would want to live in. None of us would want that, okay? And so we're supposed to be distraught with guilt over that. The sin that Western civilization committed by not holding itself back and leaving this entire hemisphere alone forever. I mean, this entire hemisphere was about 5,000 years in the past. It was living about 5,000 years behind pretty much the whole rest of the world. And the implication is that the whole rest of the world was supposed to just kind of sit there and wait. Say, hang on, guys, we'll let them catch up. No, don't go over there. Don't, that whole thing, they own all of it. Everything on that side of the Atlantic, they own everything. We can't go over there. The whole thing. They're about 5,000 years behind. They'll give them about 5,000 years. They'll catch up. They'll be fine. That's what that is basically the claim now. And it's so crazy that you can't even hardly put it into words, even though I've been putting it into words for a long time. And now, for that sin, we've lost the right to look at Indian artifacts in museums. And the last thing that I'll say here is that if there are artifacts or exhibits that deal with a certain ethnic group, and the people in that ethnic group don't want us to see it, that's all the more reason why we should. Because it's like, not only should we not give ethnic groups like the veto power over what museums say about them and their history, but actually, if they want to veto it, that's all the more reason why, like, that's the most important thing we should see in the museum, actually. So if there are Indian groups coming in and saying, oh, no, we don't want that, you can't show that, we can't. No, everyone needs to see that, whatever it is. Like, whatever it is you're embarrassed about, we should all see it. Because you don't get to do that. You don't get to go in selectively and say, I don't like that part of our history. You're not allowed to talk about that now. And of course, the ultimate effect here, ironically, is that Native Americans are just being completely erased. While we hear so much about representation and visibility, we're actually simply erasing Native Americans from the culture completely. And we're doing it at the behest of Native American activists who are asking to be erased. Think about it, a decade ago, Indians were like 100 times more visible in our culture than they are today. It took this age of representation and visibility to make them invisible. And to do all of that, again, in the name of tolerance for the very people whose likeness and history we are throwing into a giant black hole to be eradicated and forgotten. It is amazing. And of course, I say all that with a certain amount of willful naivete, because what I actually realize is happening is that they're not just erasing the history and then leaving a blank space. No, the point of erasing it and not letting us talk about it or see it in a museum is so that you can then recreate a different history. So the whole, like, the noble savage myth, this sort of like idea of natives that you find in the Pocahontas movie in the 90s, right? A total cartoon, no bearing on reality. But that's what they want. They want to create that. So I know what they're embarrassed about in the museums, like all evidence that this was a primitive, violent world when it was dominated by native tribes. They don't want any evidence of that. They don't want you to know that. You're not supposed to know that. And they want to get rid of all that. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.